This subject is one that's been on my mind for a long while. It goes back probably 20 years or more. I was an invisible Christian in the university for a long while, and then by various means I was pulled out of my ivory tower by students. That meant I got to know them. As long as you don't get to know your students, they're all right, you can keep them at bay and take no notice. But once you allow them into your home, you get to like them, and then they ruin your life. That's the way it works. But the result was that I started getting invitations from them, rather pressing invitations, to turn up at graduation. I never went to graduation. I thought it was a total waste of time. I had better things to do with my time than sit around for hours. But their parents wanted to meet me. I was some kind of, I don't know, urban legend or whatever. So I had to go. And the first time I went, I turned up a bit late, so I hadn't got a program. Slipped into the back row of the faculty. And on the graduation program was the Hippocratic Oath. And I listened to what they were saying, and I thought, there's no way Hippocrates wrote that. So I got a copy. And of course, they had edited it on the night before graduation, basically, and it showed all the evidence of that. And I started thinking about it, and slowly began to realize how our world was changing. And I just want you to, if you get to go away with 4 ideas about medicine that you need to talk about to your friends over the next little while. 4 key ideas that, amazingly, God gave to polytheistic pagans 2,500 years ago. And I'm so glad he did that to pagans, because I can talk about Hippocrates in any secular setting, nobody's going to get cross. Whereas if I talked about Christ, they'd get cross. The oath opens with the invocation of transcendence. I vow by Apollo, Hygeia, Panacea, and Asclepius, and all the gods and goddesses. Now, no modern Christian would take that oath pretty well. But Christians took it for hundreds of years, thousands of years, because they were more sophisticated than we are. They took it in the form that the Hippocratic physicians wrote it to honor them, the writers of the oath. But its validity depended upon them making the oath to the God they believed in, which of course is what they actually did. I mean, when we go to court in Canada and ask people to swear on the Bible who don't believe in the Bible, what on earth does that mean? It means absolutely nothing. Now, you can ask a Muslim to swear on the Quran, and that will mean something. You know, the Veda would be a bit more difficult, but what do you ask an atheist to swear on? Nothing. It's a problem. It's a huge problem. So way back in the time of Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, the world that we're now about to re-enter, he arranged the exit from that world. Because in the ancient world, physicians killed for profit. It's very easy to kill people. Any physician worthy of his salt could kill any of you, and there'd be no evidence. I could even have a meal with you. I could eat the same meal as you. You'd die, I wouldn't, and there'd be nothing to find at post-mortem. That's pretty good, isn't it? I won't tell you what it is in case you're currently at war with your spouse, but a doctor could kill very easily. And they did. They had very little in the way of medicine to offer. It was basically diet, exercise, and common sense and prognosis, all they had. But Hippocrates and his fellow physicians understood that trusting your doctor is important. And if your doctor kills you or can kill you, then that's corrosive of trust. And of course, Beverly McLaughlin et al. Had no historical analysis in their decision about euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide. They called it medical-assisted death, isn't it? What a wonderful acronym. I wonder if they were aware what they were doing. Certainly there's irony in it, but it's a frightening thought. If you know that your doctor can kill you with impunity, you better know a bit more about him than you would normally know. Think of those people I was talking about yesterday who are in medical school that no one trusts after 3 weeks. You can imagine a few years' time, one of them is leaning up against a bar and somebody comes up to him and says, my Uncle George is under your care. If he doesn't survive this illness, you might get a Mercedes. Would they be tempted? Some would be tempted for a Ford Taurus. I mean, of course they're going to do it. It's already happening. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. Now, if there was one group of people in Europe who you might think could do this well, it would be the Dutch. Here's another amazing irony. During the Second World War, Hitler ordered, when he'd taken Holland, he ordered the Dutch physicians to start killing the disabled and the handicapped. And they refused. Even when he took the leaders of the medical profession and sent them off to concentration camp, they still refused. And Hitler needed the Dutch doctors to look after the Wehrmacht, so he had to give in. So at the end of the war, the Second World War, only 2 countries in Europe in the Third Reich had significant numbers of handicapped people. One was Holland, the other was Denmark. The reason for the Danish ones was that the king and queen and family wore the yellow star, and the Germans backed off. Yet, a mere, 30 years later, 40 years later, the Dutch became the first country in the Western world to legally kill patients again since the time of Hippocrates. Well, it took a little longer than that. For the last 2,000 years, anyway. I have no explanation for why that happened. And they set up all the regulations to make sure that it would not be abused. Every one of those regulations has been broken without any consequence. And from the beginning, the Dutch government have done regular surveys, and between 500 and 1,000 people, every time there's been a survey, are documented as having been killed in the previous year without any evidence of consent. That's what happens when you make evil good. And the fact that there was no discussion of this whatsoever in our Supreme Court is beyond belief. But that's where we've got to. It is a very, very frightening step forward. Margaret Somerville, who you probably read quite frequently in the newspapers, takes the view that history will view this debate as the most important one in the 21st century. I'm not sure I would go quite that far, but what's entangled with this is certainly going to be the most important discussion of the 21st century. It will determine our future in a very, very big way. Because as J. Budziszewski puts it, we are logical still, but slowly. We move steadily from one position to the next, pushed by the logic of our own previous decisions. So just as I pointed out that once abortion was allowed for rape and for incest and for serious disease, then it got pushed to mental disturbance in the mother, then it got pushed to infanticide, which is where it's got to in Holland now. At the other end, we've got the killing of the elderly happening already illegally. It's not going to get less when it's legalized, it's going to get more. And of course, we become much less sophisticated. Interestingly enough, there was an attempt to do this, probably nearly 20 years ago, the first attempt to get a euthanasia act through Parliament was done as a kind of backdoor maneuver. The bill was promoted as being a protection for physicians who increase the amount of painkiller towards the end of life in order to control the pain. There was no need to do that, but it was really open season on killing after that if it went through. Fortunately, one Catholic senator's assistant noticed that all the people presenting to this committee were in fact people who were on the pro-death side of the argument. There was no pro-life side of the argument being presented. So he got on the phone and there were about 48 hours left to get a submission in, and he had to track down 3 people in Ottawa at least who could do a decent job. And John Scott, who works in palliative care at the Bruyère, he tracked him down. And André Lafrance, now deceased, who's a Catholic who'd kept all the literature in this area organized obsessively, and myself. I was the last to go on the second day, and the guy who spoke before me was not one of us 3. John did a superb job, and so did André Lafrance. I had an amazing experience because the guy who spoke before me actually sent the committee to sleep. He was very boring, a monotonous voice and nothing. And so when I got to the microphone, the chairman of the committee said, "Dr. Patrick, put your submission down. We will read it into the record. It will be there. Now speak to it." So I was commanded by the chairman of the committee just to talk. I was amazed listening to what I said, because I had the experience of the promise of the gospel, have no fear what you will say. I wish I had written what I said, but I hadn't. I was on such a high at the end of it that I don't remember the end of it, but somebody sent me Hansard, and the chairman of the committee said, Dr. Patrick, if you use a scalpel like you use words, I would like to come and watch. The three of us stopped that bill because the committee realized the discussion had not been adequate. But this time it's going to go through, either by default or by some agreement. It's going to be the first test of our new Minister of Justice. She should ask for a delay so that it doesn't go through by default, as abortion has gone through, and should set up proper consultation, which excludes people like Beverly McLaughlin, and includes people who realize, like Margaret Somerville, that this is important. Because what makes a nation is what it holds in common, right? If we have a common story of meaning, we can survive. When we no longer have a common story of meaning, we cease to be a nation in any real sense of the word. We become collections of people agreeing to live together for our own convenience. And the Canadian way at the moment is not to say anything that upsets anyone. That's all right as long as we still agree about most of the important things. It ceases to be so when we don't agree about important things, which is where we are now. So we are going to be forced to deal with the question, what kind of society do we want to be? And we've got to learn how to do that by asking questions. So, first question you've got to learn to ask is, to your friends who say, I think medical assisted death is important, is what will prevent those doctors from killing you for other people's benefit rather than yours? And the answer is nothing. And it takes a long while to catch people who are doing it. I mean, that British GP who got into the habit of killing people and realized, as most people who do this, that it's upsetting to him, nobody noticed. In the end, he had to get somebody to change their will in his favor in the morning and kill them in the afternoon before somebody noticed. And he committed suicide in prison. That's the road we're going down. That's what happens when there is no transcendence. Here's something else you should put in your phone to go and look at it and learn it and read it and share it. It comes from a man called Arthur Leff, L-E-F-F. Now, I collect thoughtful writers who are not Christian. It makes it so much easier. If you're doing apologetics, if you can find an atheist to make your point, why on earth would you not quote him? Now, as far as I could discover, Leff does not believe. He taught common law at Yale for many years, but by the late 70s he was already upset about what was happening to law students. He wasn't sure that they were going to be that interested in justice. So he gave a very famous paper at Duke. I discovered a few years ago that he actually tried it out first right here in Ottawa. So it's in the Ottawa Law Review as well, the first attempt at it, but the polished version was given at Duke in 1979. And the opening paragraph is worth having in your head. I can quote it, paraphrase, at will. And it's very useful to be able to do that. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete immanent, that's not imminent next week, immanent is a technical term meaning accessible to you. So a complete, understandable, and transcendent set of propositions about right and wrong, findable rules that direct us as to how to live our lives righteously. Now he's an unbelieving Jew. What he wants is for the law, Torah, to be from God. Because if the law does not come from God, why on earth would the judges be controlled by it? They're in control. And justice disappears. And loyalty takes over. That's what's happening to us already. And he knows that's the problem, and he wants justice. But he goes on, he's honest, he says, but I also want to believe, and so do you, in no such thing, but rather that we are wholly free to decide for ourselves what we ought to do and what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is at the same time to discover the right and the good and to invent it. You cannot have both. We are currently deciding, and our Supreme Court is quite sure, that they don't discover the law, They make it. But on what grounds do they make it if they don't believe in God? They make it on the only grounds left to them, their own desires. Now, what Left does next is very unacademic. This is in the Duke Law Review for 1979, if you want to find the full paper. He lays out the outcomes of those two views. What happens when we believe there is a God to whom we will give account, and what happens when we believe there's no such God? And it's not nice reading. At the end, the last two paragraphs are both wonderful in their commitment to truth and sad in the conclusion that is drawn. He's Jewish, and he's at Yale in the 1970s. Social Darwinianism is the norm. He cannot bear to say no. But he is honest. He says, looking around the world, it seems to me that we are all that we have. In other words, there is no God. Darwin is king. He doesn't mention Darwin, but he's there. Looking around the world, he says, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Only if the law was unnatural and unspeakable by us would it be unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything is up for grabs. And that is the first academic comment I know that points out that following Roe v. Wade in the States and throughout the Western world, the law became the pursuit of power, not the pursuit of justice. That's very frightening. He goes on, however, he can't live with his own conclusion. He says, nevertheless, napalming babies is wicked. Starving the poor is wrong. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in this world such a thing as evil. He just said there wasn't. Now he knew what he should do. He was technically well trained. If you have a technically correct argument and you arrive at a clearly unsustainable premise, what must you do? Clearly unsustainable conclusion. You must go back to the premise. And he should have rewritten that penultimate paragraph. Thus, he should have said, because we all know that napalming babies is wicked, starving the poor is wrong, buying and selling each other is depraved, because we all know that, it looks to me as though we cannot be all that we have. Because we cannot get that knowledge without there being transcendence around somewhere. The denial of transcendence turns the law into the pursuit of power. Now, 3 sub-faculties in the university actually teach this now in many schools. Black studies, women's studies, and homosexual studies all teach that the law is about power, not about justice. If you don't believe that works out, just go to firstthings.com and search for Martha Nussbaum and homophobia, and you will get what will shock you. Here's a first-class scholar actually misrepresenting her own work in order to advance the cause of the homosexual community. That's where the law has become the pursuit of power, not the pursuit of justice. So it matters to a society whether at its heart what opens our Charter of Rights, and which they wish they hadn't put there, one nation under God. It matters that we believe that and we defend it. And here's one way you defend it. We all want justice. You cannot find a philosophy of justice without transcendence. There needs to be something to which you will not bend the knee. So you need to ask your doctor, do you believe you will be judged for your behavior after death? If the answer is no, you say, I better find another doctor, because you could kill me if this law goes through with impunity. Not a small thing. Now, these pagans got that 2,500 years ago. They also got the next thing which we miss and get wrong, which is even more extraordinary in a way, because what happens in the discussion is that they clearly understand the nature of medicine in a way that will not be taught to a medical student today. Medicine is not primarily a technical, skill-based activity. It is those things, but that is not its primary source of power, its primary source of meaning. When you go to your doctor, do you have to take his advice? No, you don't, do you? You are a free agent. You can say no. So if that is the case, what is he actually doing? Well, I think what he should be doing is trying to help you to decide what you ought to do, right? Now, ought is not a scientific term. It's not a technical term. There are no subjunctives in technique or in science. As Lewis said, you cannot get from the indicative case to the subjunctive tense by any means that man knows of. They're not connected in that way. Oughts and shoulds and musts make the difference between us and the animals. They do it because they must, in the sense they're driven by instinct and reflexes. They have no choice. But we know we do have choice. Now, it's easy to illustrate what's at stake. Imagine this gentleman on the front row here has cancer. I don't know his name or anything like that, but just imagine for a moment he has. And last week in my laboratory, I invented a cure for his cancer. Now, ought I to give it to him? Come on, you've had lunch, but surely there's some... yes. Even to someone you don't know, you ought to be charitable. But you know I'm out to get you, and you didn't want to get gotten, so to speak. But what if I know that he is a wealthy man, and when he dies, I get his estate, and I'm a Darwinian? What should I do now? Nobody knows I've got the cure. I should obviously keep it, shouldn't I? I've got 22 grandchildren and plenty of money to spend on my genes, so to speak. And that's the problem for the Darwinist view of the world. No individual altruism is logically entailed. You can only get from the physical facts to the moral injunctions if you import into the argument the idea that to save life is good. But what this bill will do is say only saving some life is good. You've started to erode this, and it will erode fast. It will change the whole nature of medicine. Now, it's going to present great opportunities for the church as well, but it's going to change the whole nature. So, Hippocrates and his colleagues understood that they needed doctors whose character was properly formed, who knew what morality was and knew how to live it. That comes not from conversion, does it? You don't become good when you're saved, you become redeemed. The people you can trust are people who have grown up with the Christian ethos, or an equally good one from a moral point of view, like the Jewish or many others, but the one we know. Dull Presbyterians, you see, are very, very important. They're reliable, like the Mennonites. If you've grown up in those environments, there are certain things you won't do, and certain other things you will do, and they're good. That's how it works. If you will keep this law, it will go well with you and your children forever. The law, as given in Deuteronomy and Exodus, is not an imposition, as the liberals would have you believe. It's a gift. How many of you know what precedes the first thou shalt not in both Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20? I'm not sure I'm hearing. I shouldn't stop doing this till I get a new hearing aid. But it's this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Could they get out of Egypt on their own? No. So isn't it amazing? Way back there, the law is introduced by grace. That would change the exposition of some New Testament churches, wouldn't it? Yes, you are not under grace, but grace and law still operate. But now the law is to tell you that you're a sinner in need of a saviour rather than to condemn you. We all know that we're sinners and we need to be reminded, because that's the way we make progress. So it was grace that introduced the law. And it's true. Where that law is operative, it is possible for a society to develop in a good way. Amazingly, these polytheistic pagans knew that that sort of thing was true. They also knew that the key test for doctors was that they would not kill. So in the original Hippocratic Oath, I will not provide an abortive remedy, I will not even counsel suicide. We're breaking all that down now, and we will erode the whole profession because of it. I have to teach students, because you can't say no directly to people in authority these days. When you are asked to do something immoral, from your perspective as a medical student or a young doctor, don't say no immediately. Ask the person who's in charge of you, may I ask you a question before I obey? They have to say yes, and this is the question. Do you wish you and your family to be cared for by a doctor with or without moral integrity? You need to think about that question. You need to put it on the fridge till you've got it under your belt properly. Everybody wants a doctor with moral integrity. It therefore follows that you mustn't destroy the moral integrity of anyone who is a doctor. Now the problem is, of course, that for the Darwinian world, there is no morality. They don't wish to face that. But in our world there is. And this is where we win. But only if the fourth of the great insights that are being neglected by Hippocrates is preserved. I will guard my life and art in purity. In other words, Hippocrates understood that the patient must give to the doctor rights of conscience. There's absolutely no provision in Obamacare for rights of conscience. And Obama and his ilk say immediately, if it is legal, then you must provide the service. They want to undermine the profession. To which my response is, do you know who said that previously? And I nearly get punched when I tell them. Of course, it was the Nazis. Everything done to the Jews was perfectly legal. And of course, the most egregious example in the United States is the Dred Scott affair, which proclaimed that black people were not people, but property. So it is amazing that a black president should introduce a law that had no rights of conscience in it. But that's where we've got to. So these things you really have got to start thinking about. If you allow your doctor to kill you, you are opening a door to a way of life which is utterly not wanted. Now this means that the church has things to do, and we're not doing them. But here is some things that you can go back with as very practical things to do. Every church, I think, needs to have a committee, and there's some lawyers here who could talk about how this should be done. But you shouldn't sign living wills, in my view. What you should do is give power of attorney to people who share your belief system, not your family primarily. Because when you die, the most important thing is that you die rightly as viewed by God. So the church should offer a power of attorney program so that when you end up in intensive care, people with due power of attorney can turn up and take care of you at that point to make sure that you don't die with a tube coming out of every orifice because the lawyers might sue. So that you can die as a Christian, witnessing to those around you that death is not something we are afraid of. Everybody's afraid of the process of dying, but not what is to come. And we need to witness to that. The right way to do that is preferably to die in your bed at home with all those you love and care about there to bid you goodbye. It is a powerful witness. John Wesley, when he was asked, isn't your new way of preaching the gospel somewhat histrionic and emotive? He would simply say, come and watch our people die. And that is the truth. Pediatrics is a good place to see this, actually. Children are closer to God than we are. One of my favorite books in this area is a little book called A Window on Heaven by Diane Komp, K-O-M-P. She, like me, grew up in a Christian home, went to university and sidelined her faith. She became an existentialist, which is a serious mistake. So she came to believe that life had no ultimate meaning. So you do what gives you pleasure. And she loved children. She was a single woman. So she did pediatrics. She ended up running the pediatric oncology program at Yale. Of course, she had a problem. If you believe that life has no meaning, what do you say to a dying child and his family? There's nothing to say. The only honest thing would be, this is absurd, I'm glad it's you and not me, and that is no help to anyone. And she was a nice lady, so she was never there when they died. That was her solution, a common medical solution. But her mother kept turning up at the back of her head saying, Diane, I didn't bring you up to desert children you love when they need you. You need to be there. And of course, you give in to your conscience in the end. And God, being who he is, showed up the first time she sat with a child. A little girl of 8 dying of leukemia. Normally we save them these days, but not in this case. Mum and Dad sitting there with Diane. But just before she died, the child had a lucid interval, something that happens to children not infrequently. So she was fading away in a terminal coma, and then she just woke up for a few seconds. She sat up in bed and said, "Mummy, can you see the angels? Can you hear their singing? It's beautiful." And she was gone, just like that. And she wasn't worried about dying at that point. It was quite clear she couldn't wait to get there. And Diane was a smart enough woman not to say this was a psychological quirk. It wasn't. It took 2 more children to bring her to faith, and I won't spoil the story for you. It is absolutely beautiful. So get the book, read it, and pass it around amongst your friends. At this time, talking about death is important, and how we do it is important. And that book can help. So that's one thing we have to do. We have to provide a power of attorney. The next thing we need to do, and we need to do a lot more of this, is every church with a reasonable number of members can afford to have a parish nurse, but the primary concern is not nursing. It doesn't need to be a nurse even. But someone who will go with the elderly for their interactions with the healthcare system. It's not a medical system anymore. It's a health non-care system shortly. You're going to need help to negotiate it. My wife went through the system just recently, and she said, if you and son-in-law had not been around, I don't know whether I would have coped with this very well, because you can, can't you? You can feel like a piece of meat that's sucked up into the grinder, chewed over and spat out, right? The residents look at you through the results, because that's what they're trained to do, and that's what we're pressurizing them to do. My son-in-law described to me this morning what he has to do in 15 minutes. That's all the bureaucrats allow him for an oncology patient. It's almost physically impossible to do it. Every now and again, he has to schedule a really needy patient for the last patient in the day, because that's the only one where they won't be on his case for the next patient. That's where we've got to. The only department in the medical system that has grown dramatically in my lifetime is administration. We're paying lots of money for administration we didn't previously need. We spent the money in other ways. The first hospital I worked in, I said, was run by a hospital secretary, his secretary, one worker and the dog. That was it. Because everything else was totally self-contained units. And it was amongst the most satisfying medicine I did. But once you start seeing that the elderly go to the doctor with an advocate who goes in for the interview with them. Now, the doctor will ask the patients what they need to know, and then can dump on the advocate who has the vocabulary what has to be thought about and what decisions have to be made. Then you go off and have as many cups of tea, coffee, whatever, until they've worked through what they want to do, and then you do it. Once you start that, you'll get elderly from other churches coming to join your church in order to have access to the patient advocacy program. We're going to need to support one another in this way in the very near future, given what the Carter decision is going to open up. We've seen it happen elsewhere. Sometimes you need to be shocked. And just a few months ago, I read of an account of a professor in Belgium, which is one of the other countries that's already done it. Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Oregon, and Washington State have legalized it. We'll be next, and the Scandinavians too. Anyway, this man got a telephone call from the other end of Belgium, and it was from a hospital where his mother was, and they said, "Your mother asked to be euthanized this morning, so we did it. Will you please come and get the body?" They killed his mother without first asking him, without giving him a chance to say goodbye, and they were not even repentant. That's what we get to very quickly. So we have reason to wake up, don't we? It's amazing that we're in this state now, because never have we had more power over pain at death than we have now. Except the existential pain, of course. That's the difference. But physical pain, we should say before, as we said previously when this went through the Canadian system, we got the right answer out of them. There should be no change in this law until palliative care of a good quality is available to all Canadians. That's what comes first. Of course, the administrators say it will save money, because we spend a lot of our total lifetime health costs in the last 6 months of our lives. So if we could get you to die 6 months earlier, we'd save a lot of money. Actually, it wouldn't work that way. We would have a vastly greater budget needed for dealing with all the neurotic illnesses that flow from doing things like that. It's interesting that since we've had let's put that a better way. Since we've had drugs that can apparently do good for things like depression and schizophrenia, which happened in the 60s, we would have expected there to be less people on disability for psychiatric disorders. In fact, there are more. It looks as though these drugs can work acutely, but if you stay on them for any length of time, they rewire your brain and you're not going to be capable of work again. That's what's happening. There's a book with a good account of it published in the last year. It's by, what's the name? Borderline or something like that. But it's put the American Mind in, published this year, it will come up. And it's a series of about, over a dozen essays by academics on what has happened to the American mind in the last years since 1987 when Bloom published The Closing of the American Mind. And it's being treated by these psychoactive drugs. Many, of course, are essentially detergents. What they do, as one of my biochemical friends put it, is dissolve your brain to make it incapable of bothering anyone else. It's not exactly treatment for the patient. So that's where we are at this moment. We have better than ever treatment of the technical problems of patients, and yet respect for medicine has gone through the floor at the same time as their abilities have gone through the roof. When I started in medicine, we didn't have a decent hypertensive treatment. We had no dialysis, no heart surgery to speak of, and we were respected. During my lifetime, all those things have been fixed, and litigation has gone through the roof. That's amazing, isn't it? That's what's happened. Because we have lost the relationships which a society should have, and which can only happen when local communities exist. The church is one of the few that could be resuscitated at this stage. Most of us in Canada won't speak to our neighbours for the next 4 months, right? Once the snow falls. That's not a community. We need to think about how we are going to set about making the church more a church which serves the community, rather than the social club, which it is by and large. Very simple question, and I must finish because my time is up. In your church last Sunday, raise your hand if confession of sin was an important part of that service. It's only a few hands going up. You realize what that means, don't you? Almost all disease that a doctor sees now has an element of self-induction. You have made yourself sick by your behavior. If you make yourself sick by behavior and those you say you love are suffering with you, you cannot avoid guilt. There is no medicine for guilt. The only solutions that the world has ever found are confession, absolution, restitution, grace, justification. Only the church can deal with those. And yet we don't even talk about sin on Sunday morning. That's got to change. We've got to get back to what Jesus taught us. After all, the first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, is probably best understood as blessed are you when you have learnt to practice internal honesty about the state of your own soul. That's what poverty of spirit is. And you have the kingdom at that point. We need to get confession back. Lewis understood this. At the end of the first chapter of Mere Christianity, he says this: repentance is not something God demands of you that he could forego if he wishes. Repentance is simply a description of what coming to God is like. Right? Can you think of anybody in the Bible who came into God's presence and started singing and dancing and singing happy songs? That isn't what happens, is it? What happens when you come into God's presence? You fall flat on your face as one dead, like Isaiah in the temple, perhaps the most righteous man in Israel at the time. God is there, but he doesn't allow us close because we're not willing to pay the price, which is confession and repentance and forgiveness. If we come into God's presence without those things happening, we would be destroyed because he is pure holiness. We cannot survive in his presence without confession, repentance, restitution, all those things. And the church has stopped teaching that because we don't want to upset anybody. On Sunday, say to your pastor, you know, you didn't upset me this morning. Isn't that your job? Because Paul thought that teaching theology would make you very cross, but it might also make you think. so that he could say at the end of an epistle, if you've understood what I've said, now your mind must be transformed so that you can do what you ought to do. And it can only happen if your mind is transformed, not your feelings. There's nothing in the New Testament that makes you responsible for your feelings. There's a lot about what you do with your feelings, but that's an act of thought. It's time the Christian mind was revived, and it's time I stopped. Thank you.